All right, welcome to today's George Blue Spruce Hero Healers Luncheon. We are blessed to have with us Dr. Weaver, who has connections to A.T. Still in many ways. For starters, he was born here in Missouri and raised in Missouri, went to college locally. I think he'll tell you a little bit about that. He has spoken, we just counted, at 3 commencements of the various colleges over a 25 or 30-year period. When the Arizona Community Health Center Association invited KCOM out to Arizona and begin to oversee, assist in the training of the 70 students who got moved out there, it was Dr. Weaver at the National Health Service Corps who provided some funds for the association to do that. And as you know, that is part of the sort of story of how A.T. Still grew into Arizona and grew some of these additional colleges here. Dr. Weaver is a friend of mine. I'm excited about you guys getting to hear from him because the idea behind Hero Healer is that you look at somebody and go, I could do that. That's a life that I could be like. I could serve others as this individual has served others. And as you may have seen on the email, he got to spend a very short time as a Surgeon General. But does have a rank of Assistant Surgeon General and a Rear Admiral, retired from the Public Health Service. He now works for the National Association of Community Health Centers, is very engaged with A.T. Still stuff. Among other things, A.T. Still's PA program is establishing community campuses based in community health centers. And he meets with A.T. Still weekly, has for a year and a half, to help plan for that. So he's a big friend of A.T. Still. He's an example for all of us. He's a hero of mine. And let's welcome Don Weaver.
That was a signal to turn on the little button. That's okay. I now do the weather up here. No, that's all right. Thanks to A.T. Still for the invitation to be here today. This is very special for me. It's special because it allowed me a time to reflect. I guess what Gary asked me to do is reflect back on what are some of the influences in your career choices, of which there were many. So I'll try not to bore you with a lot of my personal history, but I think it sort of relates kind of to all of us, how we're so blessed of people that we interact with throughout our lives that steer us in ways that maybe we hadn't planned. I find now that I'm retired from the Public Health Service and spending some time at NACHC, I get more questions about, well, how did you plan your career? And I'd love to sit down and say, oh yeah, there was a map and I had this idea. I mean, even when I was in medical school, if you'd have asked where I would be at this stage in my life, I was going to be a pediatrician in Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont. I'm a family physician in Washington, D.C. So life changes, and we'll talk a little bit about that as we go along. We had an amazing tour yesterday, and thanks again to Jason for just a wonderful time at the museum to remind me of a lot of things that I did know about Dr. Still and a lot of things I didn't know. So it really reminded me about caring for the whole person. And you know, we talk about it, and we saw a slide today at the presentation on research over at the dental school, and it was a quote, you know, about yes, of course, dentistry is part of what, you know, the whole person, and it was 1921 was the quote. So it was a good idea then, it was an even better idea now, and maybe we're finally waking up to what Dr. Still was trying to remind us about body, mind, and spirit and how all things go together. It's extra special for me because I had the good fortune of, while serving in the Public Health Service with Chris, but also we both had the opportunity with George Blue Spruce. So to be involved in something that honors George, who's just an amazing man from my perspective, makes this very much extra special to me. When I went back and tried to reflect and sort of make some sense out of how you tie all of this together, I came up with some sort of words and terms. It's about people, including patients, that certainly have influenced my life. I mean, I hope every student who's here knows what we all learn, I think, but sometimes we're a little slower to pick it up, that our best teachers are our patients. They teach us every day. We just need to listen and figure out what they teach us, and we'll talk a little bit about that. It's really about pictures, and it's also about mentors. And so I'll sort of try to use those 3 themes as I go through. And let me start. As Gary mentioned, I'm a native Missourian. There are 2 very special people in my life with regard to Missouri. That's my mom and dad. My dad's no longer with us. My mom is now 93 and suffers from dementia. So she's had part of her life taken away, but it continues to teach me about very important issues. But they really brought me up with some basic structures that I think, as I look back, and it was about whatever you choose to do, and my dad would say this all the time, just be the best of whatever you are. Just do it. And he said, God's given you some talents, just use those talents to the best of your ability. He also said, give something back. We're all so fortunate in what we're able to do. Make sure you give something back to society. He and my mom modeled that with all the work they did in our school and our church. Do something to help the less fortunate was certainly something I was raised to do, and to treat everybody with dignity and respect. So I was pretty fortunate from birth in St. Louis and growing up in Jennings, Missouri, which is a suburb of St. Louis, for those of you that are not familiar with the community. And it really was based in our faith, both in our church and a camp that, for those of you that are from Michigan, is on this part of the state, 30 miles north of Muskegon, 30 miles south of Ludington, for those that want to know. But it was Camp Minnewanka, which was a camp that I had the good fortune of attending, but also serving on their staff. And it was about Christian character education and Christian leadership training. Interestingly enough, one of their messages is that you had to have a balanced life. They did it fourfold: mental, physical, religious, and social. So we sort of took Dr. Stills and stretched it a little bit. And actually their motto is something that has always sort of stuck with me, and it was my own self at my very best all the time. And I think those sort of set the foundation for where I started out. We were very fortunate to have a wonderful family physician, Dr. H.G. Herman. I don't know what year yet, but he's a Kirksville graduate. I'm guessing in the 30s at some point in time. And I bring that up because Gary and I were talking about this before. I don't think you realize it at the time, the influences people have in your lives. I mean, I can vividly remember, and I remember this is ancient history now, but under fluoroscopy in his office, where he actually set my arm that I had broken by skating in the basement on a concrete floor, which I suppose I would now say was not a good prevention measure, but we did what we needed to do. And also where he was probably way ahead of his time in removing my tonsils in an ambulatory setting, observing me for a while, sending me home and doing home visits for the next 3 days to make sure things went out all right. And I'm sure, and I guess you could almost trace it back, and I thought about it yesterday, Jason, to Dr. Still, who had an influence on Dr. Herman, who had an influence on me. When people say, why in the world, when you were in junior high school, when somebody said, what do you want to do? I said, I want to be a pediatrician. I enjoy spending time with people. I thought pediatrics sort of had a nice bent because I like to deal with healthy people in general, and children tended to bounce back from things. And we'll talk a little bit about that as my training progressed. And so I think he had an amazing influence on my life that I as I look back, sort of brings me full circle back to this amazing place where he trained. Growing up, I've sort of talked about in Jennings. I went to college, as Gary mentioned, in Missouri, a small school in Fulton, Missouri called Westminster College. For the record, although I would be old enough to do that, I was not there when Sir Winston Churchill gave his famous Iron Curtain speech. That was March the 5th, 1946. For those of you that, something you had to memorize when you were a student there. But I was there, actually, when they brought St. Mary Virgin of Aldermanbury Church over stone by stone from England, because as one might or think about, I didn't at the time until I realized I'm going to this school and there are rocks all over everywhere. You take churches down from the top to the bottom and you build them from the bottom up, so you had to have all the stone over there, except for the ones that I believe it was described that the Luftwaffe had architecturally changed during bombings of London, so they had to carve other stone. But it was an amazing experience for me. I was a chemistry major. From the point of view of two other mentors that I had, Dr. McCright and Dr. Schultz, I was somewhat of a failure for them, because their idea of what a successful chemistry major did is you got your doctorate in chemistry and went and taught chemistry. And I'll never forget Dr. Mack saying to me, he said, Weaver, he said, you're thinking about going into medicine. He said, those are just glorified barbers. He said, PhDs are the royal family. And I said, well, I'll tell you what, Dr. Mack, if you're in an emergency room about 10 years from now, you can decide if you want to call the barber or if you want to call the queen. And we'll decide what would serve you best. And that was the kind of relationship we had. But they were people who really supported anything you wanted to do. And I think something else that I again, reflecting back on that experience at Westminster that was special for me. For those of you that are not familiar, it's a small college. It was actually 625 students when I was there. I think it's a little over 1,000 now. It was all men at that point in time. Thank goodness now it's co-ed, and I think about 50-50 or maybe a few more women than men. But they had a lot of pre-programs, so pre-med, pre-law, pre-business. And one of the programs that they had was because it was a Presbyterian-affiliated school, they had a program for people who were thinking about going to the seminary. And whoever was the senior for that year, there were many small Presbyterian churches in rural Missouri that could not afford a pastor, and the senior would ride the circuit and preach in several different places. My senior year, they didn't have anyone who was sort of, we used to say pre-God, but I mean that was, but that was going on to seminary. And I had taken enough religion courses that Dr. Gates said, would you be interested in doing that? And I had the good fortune of riding the circuit to some pretty small places here, not too far from here, actually. The good news was if you had a 9 o'clock service and a 11:30 service, you could use the same sermon because they weren't, in the two communities, didn't compare notes. But I think it really gave me an opportunity to appreciate community even more and realize the important role that faith played in these people's lives. So it sort of took me the next step. Before you know it, we were off to medical school. I guess that was a good step as well. Took me away from Missouri and to Massachusetts and Boston. And, it was really there that, as I think about people who influenced my life, Doctors Klein and Cohn were pretty amazing in being mentors for me. Dr. Klein, in a very troubling time, as those of you that are, maybe can recall your first year, and this was like 2 months after I started medical school, I got a call from a physician in St. Louis who said my father, who had surgery for a renal stone, developed gram-negative sepsis. I didn't even know how to spell it, much less realize how much trouble my dad was in. They were there to comfort me at that end, but also I got a call from his physician at St. Luke's Hospital in St. Louis, who also was incredibly comforting at the other end to tell me he was there, he was taking care of things, and he would keep me in the loop. What I didn't know until time later, Dad obviously made it through that very, very well. Thank goodness to a lot of wonderfully trained physicians and a lot of prayer. That physician who had called me had looked at all the plane schedules, knew when I could get a plane in Boston and get back home, because being an only child, it was Mom and Dad and myself. So I think this whole idea of part of being in healthcare is about caring for others and how important family is. And I make an assumption that family being important to me means that everybody that I'm privileged to see and serve, family is important to them. And I want them to feel about their families and have the same benefits that I've had the good fortune of having. Other things that happened in medical school, which I thought were sort of interesting. Mrs. G is a patient that I had. And I think it was in my second year, it may have been in my third. We were sort of in those times when they were transitioning into when you could really get into clinical care sort of thing. And I think it was late in my second year. And Mrs. G, and this would not be something that anybody would be exposed to these days, but they were sort of open wards. Imagine that a room about this size had beds all the way around it, had little curtains that was the only privacy that folks really had. And when you went in and made rounds and stuff, I mean, you'd stand in the middle, you'd sort of go and you wouldn't talk loudly. It was before HIPAA, but I mean, you would sort of talk in a low voice, but I mean, everybody was in this big room. I spent a lot of time with Mrs. G. I don't even remember what her diagnosis was, but one day when I came in, she called me over and I said, yeah, she said, pull the curtain. I said, yeah. So I said, what do you want to talk about? And she reached in her drawer and handed me some money. And I said, she said, you're my doctor. And I said, no, ma'am, I'm a medical student. And she said, no, you're my doctor. You're the person that spends the most time with me. I didn't know what to do. I sort of thought it was inappropriate to accept it. On the other hand, I didn't want to insult her to say no. So what I ended up doing was there was an anatomy text that I'd wanted for some time. I used what she'd given me, added some money to it, bought the book and the next day went over, and I still have it at home where she has written in there what she meant. But I guess, again, a reinforcement by a patient who taught an important lesson. Please spend time with me. And it wasn't that the others weren't interested in her health. Obviously, they had much more to offer than I did. I was a student. But I could sit there and listen. And I think that's something that, you know, we sort of learn over time it's very important. It was during that time, while I was in medical school, that a person who now for over 43 years has been certainly my best friend. It's my wife, Jane. And, you know, there's always very important that you have somebody who is a source of support for you, because you're going to be to share the joys and excitements of things that happen, to be there to share some of the sorrows that you have, but it's always incredible to have that best friend. I say a lot now about, and we'll talk a little bit about other parts of our family, but you know, I was able to do a number of things, both in practice and in the public health service, and away sometimes for a bit, because she was there with our daughters as our family was raised. And it's an incredible trade-off. She traded off her profession, actually, because she was an amazing teacher. She's still an amazing teacher. She just doesn't hit in the classroom per se. But it was a very important part that changed my life when I was in medical school. Then it was on to residency, you know, and I was very fortunate. I got the residency spot that I wanted, so we're still on the pediatric track. We'll get back to that in a second, at Boston Children's Hospital. And that year, a revolutionary thought was that interns, they weren't called PGY1s then, they were called interns, were going to be given an elective. And I was actually was the first person in that group of 12 that was going to get an elective for the month. I thought, oh, this would be great. And I thought, oh, cardiology, pediatric cardiology. It turned out that Boston Children's had kind of the father of pediatric cardiology. His name was Alexander Natus. Oh, Dr. Natus has been booked for months. You know, it can't. Oh, infectious disease. That's something that children, you know, experience. No, why don't you do behavioral pediatrics? Whoa. And it turned out, and you know, you talk about serendipity. I had the good fortune of meeting and interacting with a physician named T. Barry Brazelton. I didn't realize at the time that he'd written books and was going to do a lot of things about it. And one of the things that he required that I do as part of that rotation, and I will never forget this, he said, 2 half-days a week, I want you to go to the daycare center in Roxbury, Massachusetts. He said, I don't want you to wear a white coat. If you feel so obligated, you have to take a stethoscope or an otoscope. He said, that's fine. He said, I want you to wear clothes that you can sit on the floor and observe normal children. He said, I want you to see what that's like, because he said, what you're going to see a lot of in our hospital are children who are not well. And he said, what better way to compare that than to see children, this is what they do. I'm forever grateful for that serendipity that 2 people weren't available, and Dr. Brazelton was, he was the same person that when we had our first child wrote a little note and mentioned to him that our daughter was born, and he wrote back, and I think it was a 2-liner. It said, congratulations, welcome to the most life-changing event in your married life. A wise man he was. And then it came to sort of the mid-second year, and I opened up, and I don't even remember which medical journal it was. I think to sort of act like you were on top of things, you would open up the magazine once in a while just to say, oh yeah, I'm a couple issues behind. And there was this ad that said, what are you doing next July? And it was an ad for this new entity called the National Health Service Corps. So this was in 1975. I thought, gee, this might be something. It would sort of follow what my parents had taught me about opportunity to give something back. For those of you that are not history buffs, this was during the Vietnam War. I had not been drafted. My draft number didn't come up. I'd been deferred for what I needed to do, and I thought, what a great way to give something back. So I wasn't obligated to do it, but I volunteered for this organization. So I went and talked to our chief of pediatrics, Dr. Avery. And Dr. Avery, I said, I know it's my second year. I checked off this box, and I told him that I'd like to do it in July of '76. And they keep calling me and saying July of '75 they'd have something available. Having spent 35 years in government, I know now how things get on the wrong list and people just don't understand. But she said, why don't you do that? why don't you go out and see what it's like to practice day in and day out for a couple years? I'll hold your senior residency spot for you, which I thought was absolutely amazing, because they would have been just as easy to say, well, if that's what you want to do, you know, as other people around. We went, we looked, we ended up in Utah. It was interesting in that I went back and asked for a third year, because we had just gotten a Robert Wood Johnson Foundation grant, and we were out in Utah with our group, and she allowed me to do that. I went back for maybe another year, and I did get the wise counsel that sometime you need to decide what you're going to do when you grow up. So we'll get to that in just a second. So we're off to Tooele, Utah. For those of you that are not familiar with Tooele, it's a community about 35 miles southwest of Salt Lake City, the next mountain range over. I tease my wife about this a lot, because she's from Massachusetts, and she said, you know, I don't care where we live when we're married, but I always want to be close to salt water. I said, you have your dream. She said, that's not what I meant. I said, you're going to need to be more specific. I said, this is even more concentrated than the Narragansett Bay, which is close to home. So we go from a 200 and some odd bed pediatric hospital to a 32 bed rural hospital. I'd had 2 years of pediatrics training. When I was in my fourth year of medical school, I don't know if y'all do this, but we had a show that we sort of roasted our professors. We did it at the end of our second year and the end of our fourth year. And so we were busy in the midst of show practice. So I took, and I had enough credit, so I took OBGYN for no credit, because I figured all I need to learn is how to deliver a baby, you know, if I'm in a 747 on the way to the international pediatric meetings in Lucerne. Much to my surprise, the community of Tooele, Utah expected physicians to be physicians. Don't you take care of adults, and don't you take care of, deliver babies and do whatever. So the Corps in their wisdom did send me for a mini residency for a month, and actually Utah has the highest birth rate in the country. So I got to deliver a lot of babies, 90 some over the 3 years that we were out there. But it was, and I figured for the adults in the emergency room, it probably, you have an app for it now, I'm sure, but there's a thing called the Washington U Manual that you could just turn the pages and figure out what you needed to do fast, and could get to where you needed to be. It was a very interesting time in Tooele, and I didn't, again, appreciate it fully. I sometimes now do a little bit of tongue-in-cheek with it. Our practice was, we had a nurse practitioner, this was 1975, had a PA, had a certified nurse midwife, had 3 of us that did family medicine. I have to say that did family medicine. I wasn't a board-certified family physician at that point in time. We had 5 dentists in the community that weren't part of our practice, but said, send us anybody if you have patients that need oral health services. And we had 2 in particular pharmacy groups in town that were more than willing to consult with us. So I sort of laugh and say, isn't that how everybody practiced? We were very, very fortunate, and had this amazing environment in which to learn from each other. Learned a lot of things. In fact, the person who probably had the most difficult time adjusting in our community was the person with regard to deliveries, was the lady who was trained to do them the best of any of us. Our certified nurse midwife, because of the other physicians in town, for 6 months had to have a physician gowned and gloved in the delivery room when Deb did deliveries. I liked it because I learned a lot from her. There was no reason I needed to be there. She was much more skilled at it than I. And she also had to sort of fight the battles a bit with the nursing staff, because the nurses thought, oh, well, since the nurse midwife's there, we don't need a nurse on labor and delivery because she takes care of that. So it was a very interesting learning experience for all of us. I forgot to mention that the facility that we were in, you could go up the back stairs, or you could use the back parking lot, and it was the county mental health center. So we had behavioral health integration before it was in, and you could actually, literally in our community, have your pickup parked in our parking lot, and no one would know why you were there, which is nobody else's business but yours when you go visit a place. Tooele was pretty amazing for me. It also was a community where we got involved in the community, and one of the things they were big on was community theater. And it was, I don't know, the bicentennial year, so for some reason I think it was Rodgers and Hammerstein's first production was Oklahoma that they did together. So we were doing Oklahoma, and I was on call for the emergency room that night when we had a dress rehearsal. So I got a call, and there was a patient, actually the family was on the interstate heading back to Salt Lake City, and so I came in and took off my chaps and my bandana and put on my cowboy hat and sutured up this child and went back to practice. The next morning, I came into the hospital, and the nurses were all just laughing. They said, what's so funny? They said, you know, after you left, this family said, is he a real doctor? Now, having stayed at a Holiday Inn Express last night, I could have said no, but I stayed there last night. But, you know, it were those kinds of experiences where you could participate in the community and be actively involved. I think were really important. You know, it certainly were for me. The other one that I think about a lot is one of the things that I did when we were out there was my wife made a wonderful Santa outfit, and on Christmas morning I would make rounds in my Santa suit and deliver. You know, as I think back on it now, I think some of these patients did have diabetes, so probably giving them candy canes was not a good idea, but, you know, yeah, it was a holiday. And I'll never forget this. Now I say elderly woman, heck, she might have been my age now, but she called me close. She didn't recognize that it was me, and she said, Santa, you know, Dr. Weaver promised that I'd be home for Christmas, and I'm still here. And I said, well, you know, he's a friend of mine, so I'll tell you what, we're going to make a deal that you'll be home for New Year's. Will that work? And she said, okay. It just was the relationships you could have with people in those settings that I think made things incredibly important. I'd spent 3 years there and then got a call from the regional office because they'd created this new position that was sort of going to work with National Health Service Corps clinicians out in the field. It was called Clinical Activities Coordinator. And they wanted people that were fresh out of the experience to sort of work with folks that were coming out brand new. Now, I didn't mention at the time, and looking back at Chris reminds me, at that time, everybody in the National Health Service Corps was a federal employee. You were either a commissioned officer or a civil servant, and I was in the Commissioned Corps of the U.S. Public Health Service, as was Chris and maybe other folks here. And I mention that because for those of you that are on a slow night that you want to win a cup of coffee or another beverage, ask people to name the 7 uniformed services, and many people get all the military services, although some forget the Coast Guard, but Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, and Coast Guard. There are 2 others that are uniformed but not military. And the Public Health Service is one of those, the Commissioned Corps of the U.S. Public Health Service. We don't bear arms. We promote health and fight disease. And then the smaller one of the group is NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. So I was a commissioned officer and started that, and they said, would you like to come work in the regional office and do this kind of work? And I'll never forget, and again, you talk about mentors and interactions that cause you to think, and Amin and I were talking about this a little bit. I called home and I said to my mom and dad, I said, I'm going to take this position in Denver. They said, well, is that going to take you away from clinical practice? And I said, well, they've worked out a deal where I can spend a half a day a week at Fitzsimmons Army Medical Center in their pediatric clinics, so I can take care of children of uniformed service members. And my dad said, but all that time you spent in school and residency, and you're going to... I said, I've thought about that. And I said, at least for this stint, I said, I may have the opportunity to influence even more people than I could on a one-on-one interaction. I said, I don't know if I'll like it or not, but I think it's something that's worth a try. But to ask the questions along the way, so at least you think about those kinds of, oh, okay, well, maybe I'll take a look and see how that might work. And it worked very well. The rest is kind of history, as they might say. Spent some time in Denver. That's where I was really exposed to the Community Health Center program. I think many of you are familiar with Community Health Centers. I will give you the Cliff Notes of Community Health Centers. And that's what got me through college was Cliff Notes. Boy, those yellow books, I just love those things. Why read Shakespeare when you can just do this short story? Founded on the principles of community-oriented primary care. This will sound familiar. I think Dr. Still would have probably said, that's the right idea. Healthcare driven by the patient in the context of family and community, that it really was the community that decided what their health issues were. And once they decided what those issues were, then they would encourage the system to address those issues sort of one by one and to continuously improve on what they did. It was a concept brought back from South Africa by one of the founding fathers of health centers, Dr. Jack Geiger, when he was a 4th-year medical student. I mention it because as you now look at the health center in your community or visit health centers around the rest of the country, it's based on those principles. That's why they have a board that's at least 51%, actual users of the service or patients, because it is driven by those patients. That's why, because it's healthcare for an entire defined population, why health centers must see by statute, and actually do by desire, everyone without regard for their ability to pay and have a sliding fee scale to take care of that. They now come in, they didn't at the time. When I was in the regional office in Denver, there were rural health centers and there were urban health centers. I think it was the Rural Health Initiative and the Urban Health Initiative. Now they come in sort of 4 varieties: community health centers, migrant health centers, which serve migrant farm workers and their families, health care for the homeless health centers, and primary care and public housing health centers, all consolidated under one act. But at the time, I got exposed to that. I also got exposed to these ideas of quality assurance and quality improvement. This does take you back. For those of you that want to look back and see what it was like BC, before computers, we used McBee key sort cards. There may be a few people here who know where those were, but they were big cards. You put a person's name on them, and then you would punch out these little triangular things along the edges, and then would take something that looked like a knitting needle and run it through. So if a patient had hypertension, it's important that you define it that way. It's not the hypertensive in room 2. It's a patient with hypertension. Very different phenomenon, because you're starting with the person and then what issue they may have to deal with. You'd punch that out, and you could run the needle through, and all the cards of your patients that had hypertension would fall out. So same basic principles that you use in a computer, but you did age, sex, medications, major diagnoses, and it was a way that you could at least look at your practice and kind of figure out how you might address some of those particular issues. Just as some practices now sort of struggle with moving to electronic health records, there were some real struggles in trying to sell people this McBee key sort thing was a good idea. In fact, I recall visiting a clinic in rural Colorado where a nurse practitioner who had returned from Vietnam, and she was down there in that community, and she was prepared to tell me where I could place that box of McBee key sort cards. It would have been terribly uncomfortable. And so we decided that maybe she could keep them on the shelf, but I really thought there was a better way of caring for her patients. So I was exposed to a lot of things in the regional office, and I had a couple of mentors there along the way. I mean, one in particular, Dr. Connor, who basically said he was the regional health administrator, and he said, you've spent enough time now in the public health service that you might want to think about a career, and if you do, he said, you're probably going to have to do a stint in Washington. Washington, for most people in regional offices, was like the third rail. You got to spend some time there, but that's you really want to get out to where the action is, which is in the regions and on the front lines. But solid advice. The other significant piece that occurred at that time, this was 1978. It was the last year that people who had not completed a residency in family medicine but had so much training and so much continuing education could sit for their boards in family medicine. So now can't do that anymore, although I've sat for boards several times since then, but it's why the pediatrician didn't end up in Maine, New Hampshire, and Vermont. The family physician ended up in Washington. Followed the wise advice of the regional health administrator and other folks there, did take a stint in Washington, came to work for the health center program. And what I realized is that, and again, along the way, people say, you might want to take a look at this opportunity. And they were always just offering you opportunities. But I spent all of my career up to that point in either service delivery systems or in workforce, which is like a National Health Service Corps. And there was an opportunity that opened up, and at the time it was called the Division of Medicine, which is where all the primary care grants are funded, where the area health education centers were funded. Actually, at that time, AIDS education training centers were funded under that as well, before they had a whole, a bureau for AIDS care. The administrator of HRSA said, you might want to look at this as an opportunity to apply. And David Sunwall was the family physician who was the head of HRSA at the time. And I mean, things you didn't know at the time. I mean, I went to interview for this job, and I'm taking notes the whole time, thank goodness. And they said, as the director of the Division of Medicine, you'll get to be the federal representative, non-voting, to the ACGME and the LCME and the ACCME, and I'm writing all these things out. I must admit, I didn't know what any of those stood for. I didn't think it was a good idea during the interview to say, now what exactly are those? For those of you that don't know, it's basically the accrediting body for allopathic medical schools, which is the LCME. The ACGME, as you might expect, is graduate medical education, so it's their accrediting body, and CME is continuing medical education. Amazing experience. It's where I met a bunch of people. In fact, I think it was through that experience that I met Fred Tinning when he was here well, it wasn't AT still then. It was Kirksville College of Osteopathic Medicine. I think that's when we can name the osteopathic medical schools on 2 hands and still have a couple fingers to boot. And now we have to get many hands out and feet and a whole host of things, which is good. I mention that because it just gave opportunities along the way. I left there and had my dream job for for the longest time in my career in the public health service, and that was director of the National Health Service Corps. I always thought that, boy, would that be a great position to have, and it was. Interacted with some incredible people, and every day heard stories about folks that made a commitment to go and make a difference in the lives. I mean, somebody said, well, what did the Corps do? And I said, it's people who chose to go where others chose not to go. I mean, that's why they were health professional shortage areas, because there weren't enough of them out in the communities where they needed to be. And people came up with different phrases. We serve because we care, America's healthcare heroes. But the bottom line was they were people who, really interrupted their careers for a period of time, or maybe it made it their career to serve underserved communities. And it was fun to be involved. And along with it, a great team of people to work with. One that I will never forget his comment. Chuck Van Annen was a physician assistant nurse practitioner. I think he went to a program where you got both degrees, if I'm not mistaken. And he said, isn't it interesting in healthcare that if somebody doesn't do what we say they should do, we say they're non-compliant. He said, shouldn't we look at it as, he said, I'm going to use a double negative, but shouldn't we use this as there is no such thing as a non-compliant patient? It's really someone that I haven't figured out a way to reach yet. And I've just got to try a different way to reach them. And as I thought about that, and as I looked at my experience, both with health centers and with the National Health Service Corps, the whole relevance of the social determinants of health, to go visit in the lower Rio Grande Valley what was home base for migrant families. I mean, these were the one place where they owned a home. And the reason they could afford it, because it was on a floodplain. And because if they had too much rain, their entire home was going to be flooded out. Or to go to Belglade, Florida, where it had the highest incidence of HIV at that particular point in time, was in Palm Beach County. Now, it was in the western part of Palm Beach County, but I have to tell you, if you took a picture of where I went to visit and with our health centers that were there and said, guess where this is, one of the last answers would have been Palm Beach County. An incredible need being met. So all along the way, wherever you ended up, you got to meet needs. And it was nice that people, allowed me to do that, I guess, is how I would phrase it. I ended up finishing my career in the public health service, 35 and a half years worth, as back with the health centers again, which was kind of fun. It was coming home in a way to programs that I loved, was familiar with, and never ceased to be amazed at every health center I visit about what's happening that's never talked about a lot. I mean, we were talking about it this morning. 1 in 13 people in the United States get their health care at a health center. I mean, that's pretty amazing. I think the big question is, the optimist in me says when everybody is covered, it's nice to have a card, but you got to have a place to go. And I can't think of better places to go than health centers, and to really get your needs met and your family's needs met. So following that, I'm where I am now. I'm with the National Association of Community Health Centers. An opportunity opened up to serve as their chief medical officer for a couple years until their transition could happen from somebody who'd been there for a long time and worked very closely with Gary on a bunch of issues. Tom was just amazing and decided, I think, that the long-distance trek from Michigan to Maryland was a little bit, enough to finally settle back in an area that he loved, and plus he could go to more Michigan State football games, I think, which may have been another influencing factor. And before Ron Yee, who's the current chief medical officer, could come on board. And have had a chance to continue to serve with them to look at ways that we can influence practice of underserved people. I mentioned pictures. I'll say if, or maybe I should say when, you come visit my office, and you're more than welcome to do that in Bethesda. If you sort of went around the room, you could look at different pictures, and I think you'll see why I mentioned pictures. Sitting above my door, it says Country Doc Weaver. It's made from an old a piece of clapboard. John Clark was a dentist that worked with us when I first came to Washington with the Community Health Center program. And John, in his spare time, refurbished homes, and that was his parting gift to me, so it sort of reminds me of my PHS time. You sort of go next over, it's a painting of Tooele, and it's done by Arlene Moss, who's our nurse practitioner, was our nurse practitioner on our team. It's a very special piece to me in that she said, you sure you want that one? There's an air in it. I said, oh, I don't see it. She pointed out to me that when she painted it, I guess the way you're supposed to put the flag on the mailbox, well, it was upside down. I said, oh, makes it extra special. So it reminds me of Tooele and the amazing time we had there. Sort of move over a little bit, and there's a picture, and you say, how does this relate? But it's a picture of still fruit, and it was actually painted by a family friend of ours from Jennings. Took him forever and a day. I saw had a photograph of a picture that I liked. He says, oh, I think I can paint that. And I mean, for years, this dear friend of the family said, I don't have the corn quite right yet. You know, well, I don't know if you ever got it quite right, but I love it, and it sits there. If you sort of go around a little bit more, there's a painting from the Tate Gallery, and it's called The Doctor. I like that one because it's a physician who's there with a sick child sitting actually, I guess a couch, and a parent sort of staring down. It was pre-antibiotic days. So what could physicians do? They could be there to comfort families, but they didn't have anything to give them. But I think it's a constant reminder of how important it was for that family that someone was there, kind of back to Dr. Herman and being there for us at home and other places when we needed him. What's amazing to me about that picture is I don't know how many years I've had that in my office, and I didn't realize that the father is actually in the background too. I always saw the mother, but he's kind of in a distance there. Then we're going to, if you go around just a little bit further, there's a picture that I hope you all are familiar with, because I had the good fortune of, when I was down at the Arizona campus, just standing and admiring the picture that DeLoss McWilliams did of Dr. Still, and you have one down here as well. And I said, gee, that's just amazing. And lo and behold, about a month and a half later from Tom and DeLoss, I have a copy that sits in my office and kind of reminds me of being there with a family, with the quilt, which you brought back memories of the quilt, the breadth of new views and all the things that DeLoss is so kind to share of what she thought about when she put it together. And then, of course, you'd be very shocked, I think, if I didn't tell you that what sits on my desk right in front of me is pictures of my wife, our daughters, and the 5 grandchildren that we have. Because I think you can't forget, regardless of where you are, and I think the more I got from Tooele and training when you were right there with people to a little further away, that's why we do what we do. You know, it's really about making sure that everybody can have the joy of a family and enjoy what their family means to them and what they do, just the same way that we're privileged to do it. There's a sprinkling of plants, and I think some bugs that inherit the plants over time, but it sort of gives you an idea that those are reminders to me about all the different things that I've been so blessed to have influence my life and my career. When I thought back on it, I thought, well, you know what? There's really nothing unique about that. I think you all could tell this story. I think you all have people who have gotten you to whatever stage you are in your life, in your career. And I guess one of the things that I keep reminding myself is there's only one thing, and they never verbalize it, that mentors / guardian angels hope that you do, and that is they enjoy doing what they did for you. The only thing they hope is that you'll do that for somebody else. I think that's the only payback, is that whether that's a second-year student talking to a first-year student, whether that's taking them around campus to convince them whether it is their live stream or not, that's, sort of thing. But I think that's extremely important. I also think in the midst of studies and tests and preparing for boards and doing kind of other things, it kind of brings you back to this is really why we do what we do. Those are necessary, understand that, but it's about what we can do to care for others and be privileged to do it. We'll go back to Dr. Still. It's about balance, and I think that's so important. Easy to say, hard to do. And boy, when it does slip, you go, wait a minute, I think I need to do a little bit better job of this, but it's okay. And a remembrance that there's going to be joy and laughter. And I encourage people not to lose their sense of humor. You can either laugh or cry about stuff, and if you have an option, I encourage you to laugh. But it's also going to be about sorrow and some tears. One of the patients that I didn't mention when I was in training was, I think she was 16 years old. It was my rotation on the hematology oncology ward at Children's, and it was a girl who had terminal brain cancer. And she had an IV morphine drip to keep her out of pain. Her parents were at her bedside. And of course, the little bit I remember about pharmacology is one of the side effects of morphine is a respiratory depressant. and only the resident could adjust the drip. And so we were adjusting the drip to do whatever we could. She stopped breathing and died. And her parents gave me a hug and said, "Thank you." Was too much for me. I had to leave. And in fact, I saw the fellow who was attending at the time, and I said, thank you. This isn't why I trained to do what I do. He says, "Go for a walk. Take as long as you want." Shed a lot of tears on that walk. Still hard to talk about today. And I came back and I said, "Steve," it was Steve Sallin. And I said, "I just did a lot of crying." I said, "This just isn't what I trained to do." And he said, he said, "That's a good thing." And he said, I don't want to go to a physician who doesn't have some feeling about, an event that didn't turn out the way that maybe he or she wanted it to turn out." Again, never forget that, a lesson taught by patients. So there are some times when there are tears as well, but I think it's a part of our overall experience. What's my wish for each of you? Golly, you'd be very tempted to say, "Oh, isn't he going to say all of you ought to go into primary care, join the National Health Service Corps, and serve in a health center?" No, I'm not here to recruit you for that. Be great if you did, but that's not why I'm here. What my wish for you is that, as I have been so blessed to have, that each of you have a lifetime of service and significance, whatever you choose to do, and wherever your life's journey takes you. And at the end, when you sort of reflect back, and this was from another mentor, actually, Ed Martin, which some of you know, said, when you really put it all together, it's about faith, it's about family, and it's about friends. And I consider patients part of that friends group. So I think all in all, I'm not so sure. Again, it's been very unique. It's been and continues to be an amazing ride for me. But I think putting in focus of this is why we do what we do, and aren't we so fortunate and blessed to be able to do that? So I will stop there. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Weaver. It occurs to me that you are in maybe the best place to share as a hero healer any place in America. This KCOM is a school that over 100 years is the premier at producing rural physicians for this country. And we've, over the last year, figured out that it is also the premier for producing community health center healers. Yeah. So this is a champion school in both of those areas, and here's a champion for the health center. So this is the right place for them to be. Thank you for that.
Well, thank you.
Yeah.